Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Alumni Association Lecture Series. And as a new feature of our lecture series, we begin each lecture with a poem. And tonight's selection is a poem by Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, American poet Mary Oliver, and it's entitled Climbing the Chagrin River. We enter the green river, Heron Harbor, mud basin lined with snag heaps where turtles sun themselves. We push through the falling silky weight, striped, warm and cold, bounding down through the black flanks of wet rocks. We wade under hemlock and white pine, climb stone steps into the timeless castles of emerald eddies, swirls, channels, cold as ice tumbling out of the white foam, sheer sheets flying off rocks, frivolous and lustrous, skirting the secret pools, cradles full of yellow hair of last year's leaves, where grizzled fish hang halfway down like tarnished swords, while around them fingerlings sparkle and descend, nails of light in the loose racing waters. Tonight's lecture, Unseating the Lords of Yesteryear, Water Laws, Historical Roots, and Future Challenges, is being presented by Michelle Bryan Mudd. Michelle is an associate professor of law at the University of Montana School of Law. Before she begins her lecture, I'm going to ask everyone to remember to please silence your cell phones. Oh. Turn off the water. For those of you who maybe have not been to our lectures before, I did want to call your attention to the artwork that has been playing behind me on the screen. These are selections of artwork from the University of Montana Museum of Art and Culture collection. And we give our thanks to Barbara Kustra for helping us organize and show this collection to you. The university does have a fabulous collection of art, and the art is on display at the President's office and one other place, help me, at the Mansfield Library. Right. So during the course of the lecture series, you will be able to see the artwork on display at the President's office and the Mansfield Library. Michelle's biography is in the program that you could pick up, and I think it's more important that you hear her than me. So I'd like you to give a warm welcome to Michelle Bryan Mudd.
This is a picture of a homestead tucked up against the Canadian border, against a small tributary of the Milk River, north of Chinook, Montana, on a creek called Battle Creek. And this is where my great-grandmother, on her own as a young woman, decided to homestead. Her name was Lena Barr, and she found this spot to be quite beautiful. When I took the photograph, I got a lot of prickly pear cactus stuck in my tennis shoes, which tells you it's a very dry place. It's a place where, as a young girl, I watched calves be born and grow up and drink very precious saved water in the prairie reservoirs, and watched my grandparents irrigate alfalfa in the creek bottom to feed their cattle operation. So this place is very near and dear to me. And I'll show you another one that is very near and dear to me. So this family ranch, we we obtained by virtue of federal law, right? The homestead laws that allowed my great-grandmother to go out there. She must have really liked peace and quiet. She got about as far away as she could. But those laws enabled her to settle there, and those laws envisioned that people needed to be able to use water to survive and prove up their claim. So a generation later, my grandfather, on the other side of the family, who was a long-haul truck driver and an avid outdoorsman, heard about the opportunity to lease a cabin site on Forest Service lands on a newly built reservoir called Hungry Horse Reservoir. And he built by hand a small cabin there and began taking his family fly fishing on the South Fork of the Flathead River, where it feeds into the reservoir. And my father took me there. It's where I learned to watch fish rise and cast my line, and I take my daughter there now. And so this is the other reason I am passionate about water law, because it's another special place to me. It's also there by virtue of federal laws, like the reclamation law that subsidized federal projects that brought water to the West, and laws that created federal reserves of land, in this case Forest Service land, and allowed multiple uses of those lands by the people. So my passion is water law, and my job is to figure out through the law how to balance some very competing goals that we see in the West. The goal of using water for progress and livelihood and profit, and the goal of conserving and being wise and sustainable in our use of water. It's a small order, right? No big deal. So I'm trying to balance those goals in my work. But we start the scale being tipped heavily towards use, progress, and the exploitation of natural resources in the West. So the talk today, Unseating the Lords of Yesterday, is about how we in the West inherited a legal system that was based on certain propositions. And those laws continue to guide the way we deal with today's water issues. And sometimes the laws may not make sense. And the lords of yesterday, I can't take credit for that phrase. It comes from David Wilkinson. And I brought a couple of books I wanted to show you today that are like the Bible of water lawyers, right? His Charles Wilkinson. So he wrote a book called Crossing the Next Meridian, Land, Water, and the Future of the West. And if law professors were rock stars, which I tell my students really some of them are, Charles Wilkinson would be the rock star of natural resource law in the West. And if you haven't read this book, it's a very phenomenal and accessible book that goes through the hard rock mining laws, the homestead laws, and all the laws that really shaped the West. And I want to read you just a little bit from the beginning to explain what the lords of yesterday mean. He says, natural resources are far more than amenities in the West. They drive the region economically, intellectually, and emotionally. These natural resources are governed by what I have come to think of as the lords of yesterday, the policies, laws, and ideas. In field after field, the controlling legal rules, usually coupled with subsidies, simply do not square with the economic trends, scientific knowledge, and social values in the modern West. This is not to say that these rules were irrational when originally adopted. Much to the contrary, they arose for good reason and in a particular historical context, the westward expansion of the 19th century. The lords of yesterday wield extraordinary influence. These outmoded ideas pervade land and resource decision-making in the West, far more so than in almost any other area of American law. This is the dead hand of the law at its most stultifying. In particular, what I want to focus on tonight is how this dead hand of the law impedes our ability to protect stream flow today. Critical though these issues may be to the West and its future, public awareness of them is astonishingly low. The lords of yesterday have been walled off because of perceived complexity. So tonight we can try to demystify them a little bit. The general public, by directly juxtaposing historical and contemporary settings, can grasp these problems and the various alternatives. It is important that this be so, because law, after all, tends to be derivative and instrumental. Law grows up from people, and it serves those people by codifying the values of non-lawyers and citizenry at large. So my focus tonight is on getting behind the law to the values of us in the West and what we can do to further shape that law today. So we're going to start by juxtaposing, as Wilkinson encourages us to do, what's happening today with the historical development in water law. Western water law, which he calls one of the most pernicious lords of yesterday. And so I'm going to tell you 3 legal stories, and we're going to take them chronologically. The first legal story I'm going to take you into is the California Gold Rush and the origin of the prior appropriation doctrine that we have in the West today. And from there, we're going to move forward in time and look at how tribes and other federal interests asserted themselves into that doctrine and tried to change it and modify it. And then we'll move forward further still and talk about the public trust doctrine, right? Access to rivers. And what does that have to do potentially with traditional water rights? So I'll give you 3 case stories. And then we'll talk about our job today. So you didn't know I was going to give you a job. I do that to my students a lot. I give them assignments. So let's move forward a slide. So about 50 years before my great-grandmother homesteaded in north central Montana, the gold miners were finding their way into this mountain range. Which one is it? The Sierra Nevadas. And they were finding that they needed to take water from its natural course and move it somewhere else to where they had staked their mining claim. They were using this water in their sluice boxes, right, to process the minerals. So water was extremely important to them. But they were doing something unconventional. And to understand why it was unconventional use of water, we have to move from the West back to the East. The classic division, right? The West versus East. But back in the East, they were happily following this common law doctrine that came over from England called riparianism. And if you were here for Robert Stubblefield's first lecture, I imagined by some gliding stream, some landowner in the East enjoying the river running along his property. In the East, riparianism meant that the landowner along the stream got to use the water. And the highest values of that water were leaving it in place because it was beautiful and because you could use it to wash your clothes, take a bath, water your couple of livestock, wet your garden, things like that. Very minimalist types of uses right along the water. And that was the law of riparianism. But the West proved too hardscrabble and different from the East to really adopt that kind of practice. And the miners were the first ones to realize we need to move the water where we need to use it. And so they moved water using wooden flumes and rock dams and other means to take the water to where they wanted it to go. Very much non-riparian, very much not near a gliding stream. And so that law didn't particularly work. And so that brings us to the case, the 1855 case of Irwin versus Phillips. And there's a miner named Phillips who's mining gold, and he decides to divert nearly the full supply of water from a stream. He takes it up in the mountains, probably to run it through his sluice box, and things are working great until some other miners move in downstream. They stake a claim along the river, but there's not enough water left in the river for them to run their mining operation. And they say, riparian law, the person by the water has the right to use it. And so they re-divert Irwin's water out of his diversion to try and put the water back in the stream bed. Classic miner behavior, no doubt. Irwin sues and says, you've trespassed on my mining apparatus and put my water back. And the question that the California courts had to deal with was, should English common law and the law of the East govern water in the West, in the state of California? And the court asked the parties for their arguments, and the miners along the water, they cited cases from Massachusetts and England, and they pulled out all the big books that say this is the law, and they gave that to the court. And Mr. Irwin, the miner up in the mountains, said, I don't have any cases. But I'll tell you what, it doesn't make sense here. And here's what miners do. Whoever gets there first gets it. And whoever gets there late misses out. And that's the miners' code. And the court agreed. And the court said, that makes more sense for the way we're using things in the West. This was public domain. The miners were staking claims. They needed to move the water away from the stream. And the first one that did it and put in all that money and time diverting the water should get a return on their investment. They should get rewarded for their innovation and hard work. And that was the philosophy of the court. And that's what came to be known as prior appropriation. You've probably heard the maxim, first in time, first in right. So it comes from the miners. It's a lord of yesterday. We still have that law today. You got it first, you have the first right. Now I'm going to point you to another book that I think is a great read by environmental historian Donald Worster. He spoke on campus a couple years ago. It was such a good talk. He wrote Rivers of Empire on the development of water in the West. And he compares it to similar water developments in other civilizations around the world. But he has some great language summarizing this doctrine. And he actually situates it inside of the philosophy of manifest destiny. He says, this was the emergent economic model of the time. Scurrying to find and possess gold, miners came to their diggings and dug frenetically without let or hindrance. Needing water for their sluice boxes, they took it without a second's thought. By that thinking, nature was assumed to exist for no other purpose than to be turned to private profit. Aside from first in time, first in right, there are other traditional hallmarks of this doctrine. They are divert the water. Even if you're moving it to a distant location outside its basin of origin, divert it. That shows you got it first, right? You have proof. You dug a ditch. You better beneficially use the water. Put it to some form of labor, right? Put it in your miner's flume. Put it in your irrigation ditch. Put it in your canal that's going to serve municipal water use, and so on and so forth. Even if in doing so, you've taken the full amount of the stream. That's fine, as long as you're beneficially using it. Please do not waste it, right? Waste it like run it across the land and not put it to some form of industrial innovation. And please don't let it sit idle, because then you aren't keeping that water in productive use. So you risk abandoning it. The other maxim that people say is use it or lose it, right? So keep it in use, use it well, don't waste it, take as much as you need. If you got there first, you get that full amount. Whatever's left, the juniors can use that, right? So that's the prior appropriation doctrine. Worcester says, under the doctrine, it mattered not at all how far from the river the user lived or how far he diverted the water from its natural course. Mattered not at all if he drained the river bone dry. This was part of our capitalist culture of the time, and it reflected our attitude toward nature. This decision was revolutionary, not only in rejecting the prevailing notion that riparian law should apply, but also in staking off state control of water law, right? This California court decided what the law of water use should be in that state. And the U.S. Supreme Court would ultimately agree. Every state gets to decide how its particular waters are used. You might ask, why would the federal government be so hands-off when it's encouraging all this Western expansion? Why would it be so hands-off about water? And that's because the government considered water to belong to the states, right? So the water within a state boundaries belongs to the state. State law decides how we divide it up and use it. So if we look, I'm going to prove this to you. Don't just take my word for it, right? If we look at the Montana Constitution, it says as much. It says that all the waters, they tried to be very exhaustive and not omit anything, right? That all the waters within the boundaries of our state belong to the state for the use of the people, subject to appropriation, there it is. That's our Lord of yesterday, for beneficial uses as provided by law. So if you looked in the Constitution of another state in the West, you'd find very similar language. So there's this idea that the states get to decide. Ultimately, California would say, we like prior appropriation and riparian, as did a few other states in the West. Other states, led by Colorado, would become pure appropriative states, and they rejected riparianism altogether. And you can read cases from Colorado where the riparian landowners who got there after the appropriative water rights holders, there's even weaponry involved, right? There's passion around water, but they lose out even though they're perched right along the stream and they could potentially be very productive. This irrigation district built farther away ends up winning the case. Coffin versus Left Hand Ditch, a very famous Western case. You can look it up and read it. Montana fell into the camp with Colorado and held that we are a pure appropriative state. We do not follow the riparian doctrine. And a poor widow named Widow Mettler is the one who lost out. She had her little house by the gliding stream, and the upstream ranch that had diverted water ended up getting her water under the appropriative doctrine. So Montana follows this particular law. Let's see, let me get my notes here. The tribes, we can't go much farther without talking about the tribes. The tribes we're going to find out that they don't necessarily agree with this assertion that all the water belongs to the state. So in story number 2, we'll come back to that particular question. But they maybe have a different reading than what our Constitution says. So the federal government was sort of hands-off during this period. They encouraged settlement that depended on water, but they didn't really think ahead to whether water was available that would match in any measure the demands of human development that would unfurl across the landscape, right? So they weren't really thinking about that. So this doctrine that started with miners would neatly extend to irrigation and municipal use for the communities forming in the West. As I mentioned, diversion was needed to prove up the homestead and Desert Land Act claims. And Western communities also felt emboldened by these large federal projects that were bringing in dams and water. They felt emboldened to locate in places far flung from water sources. Do any come to mind? Particularly in the desert, right? We've got Vegas and Phoenix and communities, by the way, that today have the highest rates of population growth in the nation and some of the lowest water supplies in the nation. So those lords of yesterday have really set some things in stone. I'll show you a couple slides. I love the historical pictures. So here's a picture, obviously extending the doctrine to irrigation. We've got flood irrigation being employed by row croppers, right? So pretty classic view. It's still the primary form of irrigation in Montana is flood irrigation. Here's, I love going through the archives. Here's from archives from the Museum of History and Industry. Here's that federal subsidy of infrastructure to take water projects to different places where they needed water. And that dictated settlement pattern, right? Here's an example of diverting a water source from its place of origin, right? And taking it somewhere entirely different. What would this particular project be? Yeah, this is the cap, and it's on its way to Phoenix. So you can picture skyscrapers at the other end of this particular diversion. So strong was the push for using water that diversions were cut across drainages and divides like those you see in the picture without much consideration for efficiency of use, right? So that really wasn't part of the equation. So the ditches and reservoirs can evaporate and seep in payment to the higher calling of use, right? In one extreme example, 2 land squatters in Montana, a lot of the old cases have squatters on the public domain. Their names were Varney and Sage, and they constructed a dirt ditch 4.5 miles long in Madison County. And this ditch moved water from Bear Creek to Mill Creek to their place on the public domain. And along the way, it lost 80% of the water. And whatever was left, they irrigated with. And there was litigation over whether that was an overclaim of a water right. And the court said, no, that's part of your water right. You need carriage water to be able to get it there. And in a case of very similar vintage, our Supreme Court said, it's not fair to require any efficiency above dirt and sage. It's funny, one of the guys' names is Sage. But dirt and sage and brush and rocks, and that's the level of efficiency that's fair to require of the people settling the West. If we required something more expensive, we wouldn't have settlement of the West. And a lot of those diversions exist in the same form today, right? So we still have a lot of inefficient diversions. Here's an example. I love this picture too. This is Civilian Corps on the Lolo National Forest building a highly efficient ditch, right? To irrigate grass for the Forest Service animals, right? So it's a farming diversion. But an example of a typical kind of diversion at that time. So water projects, whether they were small or large, essentially created newly engineered hydrologic systems, right? We took the natural hydrology and we engineered it. And our whole communities and society have built up around these engineered hydrologic systems. So wherever the water seeps, there's another user that's getting water, right? And they're all depending now on this altered landscape. And Worcester says, at bottom, we in the West are a hydraulic society. That's what we are. So the traditional notions of prior appropriation are ensconced both physically on the earth and legally in the law. So not surprisingly, we don't have courts eager to change our prior appropriation doctrine today to reflect new values like in-stream flow for the fishery and recreation. Under the lords of yesterday, those uses are non-uses. They're not protected traditionally. If there's water left in the stream, that's water that someone should divert and use, right? That's the sentiment. And that's not just an old sentiment, right? It's a sentiment that many people still hold today. So I have a very dear rancher friend who stands next to his creek and watches the water go by because the irrigation ditch is already full. And he says, look at all that water going to waste. What a shame, right? So it's a very important part of our paradigm still, that idea of use versus waste. And one that we're struggling to try and mesh together. There's a Colorado decision where a water user tries to get a water right for in-stream flow for a fish hatchery. It's pretty useful and industrious. The court says we're unwilling to abrogate traditional prior appropriation law and recognize this flow right. The legislature has to pass a law. We're not willing to upend this traditional doctrine ourselves. So we see this push to convince state politicians to recognize flow as beneficial use. And that takes some time. But before we get there, we need to go back to the Milk River country. Not too far from my great-grandmother's homestead. On the Milk River, the year before Montana becomes a state. So what year would that be? 1888. In 1888, the federal government enters into a treaty creating the Fort Belknap Reservation, which is comprised of two tribes, right? The Assiniboine and the Gros Ventre, known as the White Clay people. And they believe they originated from white clay in the river bottoms. So another origination story relating to water, to tie it into last week's talk. This treaty creating this reservation says nothing about water. Like if I was teaching my students how to draft something today, I would be like, you got to talk about water. But somehow it didn't come up. And this is Montana, and our territorial legislature in Bannock says we adopt the prior appropriation doctrine. Our Constitution says prior appropriation. And so there are settlers in the Milk and reservation interests both trying to build the first diversion, to be first in time. And the settlers, the off-reservation settlers, finish first. And they say first in time we have seniority. And the case goes to the U.S. Supreme Court of Winters versus the United States, and the year is 1908. And the U.S. Supreme Court confronts the question, does state law really decide all water use in the state? And the court says no. And here's why. Because when the tribes entered into this treaty, it was their permanent homeland. And if you are going to have a permanent homeland, you kind of need to have water. You can't really live there without water. And the tribes would have assumed that they had water to survive. So the court says state law does not decide this question. The reservation is created 1 year before statehood and the diversion by the settlers. So the reservation gets to be first in time. Does the court helpfully tell us how much water the tribes get? Of course not. They're not going to do anything more than they're asked to do, right? So they leave open the question of quantification. Questions we are still living with today, are we not? Yeah. And they simply say it's that amount necessary to fulfill the purposes of the reservation. That's really helpful, right? But that is why today we read in the paper about compacting, right? Or in some states that aren't doing compacting, it's just litigation over the amount that a particular reservation has. This idea of reserved rights extends to other federal reservations of land that require water. So if we go to Yellowstone Park, the water's pretty important to the reason that park was created, right? The hydrologic uniqueness of it. So that park has protection for its waters as well, negotiated between the state and the federal government in the form of a compact. If they don't resolve it through compacting, they're left with years of costly litigation in the court system. So the compacting, I think, probably saves money in the long term. All right, so that is the story of federal law creeping its way into state law and illustrating that there are areas of preemption. Later on, the Endangered Species Act will be another federal law that the courts find can affect state law over water use. All right, staying on this, I wanted to add one more thing. All right, even though federal law can preempt state law in some ways, there's still a very utilitarian bent to the Winters Doctrine, because the court went on to note that Congress intended these tribes, the Assiniboine and the Gros Ventre, to become civilized and agrarian. It's an interesting case to read today, to hear some of that old language applied to these peoples. So the court said in later case law, we should look at how many irrigable acres these reservations have, and from there decide the amount of water. So even though the tribe may not necessarily be interested in that, it's a utilitarian way to figure out how much water they have. And so for those of you that came to Rosalind Lapierre's talk last week, there's not really a water right recognized for sacred concepts of water. It's an area I want to actually work on further in my own research, is figuring out how to use the law in that way. The closest tribes have gotten are under treaties that do recognize fishing rights to usual and accustomed places. In Montana, we have one of those treaties for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai, the compact you've been reading about in the paper. So that's one of the few tribes that has flow associated, in-stream flow associated with their water right, not just irrigable acreage. Right. I would be remiss not to mention the public trust doctrine, because you also hear a lot about that in the paper. The right of the anglers to access the stream and wade. So one last legal story. more recent in history. Where are we now? The Dearborn Valley, right? So let's move up to the 1980s, when there is a very irascible landowner in the Dearborn Valley. I think the court even uses such language, so it's not just my own value judgment. His name is Michael Curran. He acquires one of the prime ranches in the Dearborn Valley. He actually owns or controls about 7 miles of riverfront property in the valley. It's also prime fishing country, right? And floating country. But he is a man of Eastern philosophy. And he recalls that it's only those who own land by the stream who get to use the water, and he doesn't like the idea that people in the West are walking on his river. And so he strings wire and other obstacles across the river to impede, some said to even hurt, right, recreationists as they came down. And so there's a lawsuit, Montana Coalition for Public Access against Curran in the 80s for the right of the public to recreate on these waters. And it's not about water rates, but I'll try to make it relevant in a moment, so hang in there with me. It's about the right to get on the water under a doctrine called the public trust doctrine. It's a very old doctrine. It rivals riparianism. I think it's even older. They take it back to Rome and Roman law. And it says that the government, and England adopts it as well, the crown, whatever the government is that owns the water, has the right to keep it free of impediments so that commerce can take place on the water. We don't want to shut down civilization, right? And from there it extends to even the government has the right to keep the water free from impediments so we can swim and bathe and boat and do other things like that. It's the public trust doctrine. So our Montana Supreme Court says we recognize that in our state. Not just on rivers commercially navigable, but even just recreationally navigable. So as long as we have a public access point to get onto the water, we can get on there and wade up to the high water mark. And so Mr. Curran loses that case. So what does access to, well, wait, I wanted to mention, so near to home, the Mitchell Slough, right? I just want to keep bringing up the newspaper articles. Mitchell Slough was about, is it a water, right? Because it had been modified, back to our hydraulic society, it had been modified so that it was part human-made and part natural channel. And the court said it's more natural than man-made. And said, so it is one of those waters upon which we can recreate and access. What does this have to do with water rates? Because water rates, remember, you have to divert and use, right? So recreating, floating, fishing, we don't have a water rate to those. So we've got these two very different worlds of law. One water rights law, one public trust law. What happens when they collide? What happens when they come together? Does the public have some kind of right that prevails over the private water right? This is an emerging question in the law. I've been writing on this topic. I find it quite fascinating. What if a senior irrigator needs the full flow of a river? Under the prior appropriation doctrine, that's fine. But what does that leave us with to recreate? And what fishing do we have? That's the question when you put the two together alongside of one another. Right now, we recreate and the fish live in what's left, right? Whatever amount that is. But there are a couple of states that have started to recognize in their case law that the public trust has to be cared for during permitting of water use. And they're California and Hawaii. I know we don't want to look like either of them, but there are interesting things coming out of those states where the California Supreme Court said to the city of Los Angeles, we know you have a water right to take waters that are feeding into Mono Lake, but the water you're taking out is damaging that lake so much that we don't think you should take it all. You have to come up with a different solution. And in Hawaii, as these old plantations are being converted to resorts, the Hawaii Supreme Court says you don't automatically get to take those old water rights and use them if you're hurting stream flow and the native people's rights to gather and the ecology of our islands. They have to be protected when you use the water. So they're trying to strike a balance between these two different ideas so that when we access the water, there's actually water there to exercise our public trust. And the prior appropriators are protected as well. It's very tricky, but that's the idea. So it's an idea, but we're not there yet. Even in those states, they're still figuring out how to implement what the court says. The courts have it easy, right? They just say, here's what you have to do. And then biologists and hydrologists have to figure out how do you actually make it happen. So today, we're still in a place where the lords of yesterday are the prevailing model, but we have things like climate stressors, right, that challenge our assumption of how water rights are used, and we have population growth. We have more importance placed on recreation and fisheries. And so we push in different ways to try and get the new values reflected inside of the old system. So, for example, the Montana legislature and other Western legislatures have passed laws that say in-stream flow can be a beneficial use. You don't have to divert water to have a water right, and those laws have been very incremental. In Montana, a senior water rights holder can now lease their water right to a conservation organization like Trout Unlimited or the Clark-Ford Coalition, and the courts will recognize it as a temporary water right. It can't do it permanently without the need for a diversion. Right? They're lengthy transactions to negotiate. They're complicated. They sometimes require efficiencies to be added, so they can create expense. They have to go through agency permitting. So when I have interviewed conservation organizations, they're doing these at the rate of like one a year, right? So it's a very valuable development, but it's not the pervasive model yet. Another thing that's happening is the Endangered Species Act. I'll put up my last slide here. The Endangered Species Act is being implicated in places like, I love getting you guys to guess, where is this? The Big Hole, where there are federally listed threatened or endangered fish species. The Federal Endangered Species Act says if you take one of these species, you face liability, which is a big hammer. But rather than fining water users that might have head gates or other diversions that hurt the fish, they can get stuck in them, right? They can get entrained, or just arguing that depleted flows are hurting the fish, they try to work with the community. So where there's the fluvial Arctic grayling, irrigators and ranchers here said, let's put in new head gates that aren't as leaky. Let's line ditches. Let's not divert from the stream when it's hot and the water flows are low. And the federal government in exchange says we aren't going to prosecute you and we will give you financial support to do this work. So we've got some models like that. Another would be, of course, close to home, the Blackfoot Challenge, right? Doing things to try to protect the bull trout and not, the anglers agreeing not to fish when the bull trout are stressed because temperatures are high and the flows are low, people leaving water in the stream. So the Endangered Species Act is another federal law that's sort of driving a wedge into those lords of yesterday. So the prevailing paradigm continues to be use it or lose it, first in time, first in right, with these modest and incremental developments in the law. So in my work, I'm still trying to figure out how Linavar can make a living on her land, and my grandfather can pull a bull trout from a mountain river, and the native peoples can enjoy traditional and modern day uses of their water. I remind my students the law is the last, not the first resort. So really, we have to get behind the law to the customs that undergird the law. We know that the miners' customs created the law. What are our customs going to be that emerge in modern jurisprudence? So I'm going to end with Wilkinson again because he is a rock star, and he said it well. He said, crossing the meridian then requires more than abolishing the lords of yesterday, the various policies and laws governing the region's rivers. It will require abolishing the philosophical ideas that fueled them and replacing those ideas with new ones, like sustainability, which implicates our population, right? And I would add climate. He wrote that book before climate was really on the scene as an issue. The crossing also requires Westerners to accept personal responsibility for the impacts on the lands, waters, and communities in a way that has not occurred before. I do believe that we must act now at this meridian or we will be too late. Not too late, perhaps, to preserve a West that mostly passes a car window test, but too late to preserve as living places the vast and sacred habitats. It would be painful to pass by the opportunity to act now because it should not be so hard to mesh the needs of land and water and people. They ought to be the same. In the last analysis, they are.
Thank you, Michelle. It was very interesting. I never ever had dreams of being a lawyer because I think it's too much work, but I love the stories behind the law. As is our custom, we are now going to open the floor for questions for Michelle. Oh, thank you.
You might need that.
We have microphones on either side. If you simply raise your hand, we'll come and have the microphone brought to you. It's important that you use the microphone because the lectures each week are recorded on MCAT and will be rebroadcast later for those of you who would like to see them again or tell your friends that missed them to tune in. So we'll have a question right there, please.
You talked about first in line, first in time, that sort of thing, and that's for the state, but we all know that rivers cross state lines and or sometimes country lines. How does that work?
Oh, that's a great question. So, as I mentioned, not every state follows exactly the same water law. And so what we get into is the realm of interstate water law. And we have right now a dispute. Have you read in the paper? Right, Governor Schweitzer sued Wyoming and the Powder River, saying that Wyoming violated the Yellowstone River Compact for a variety of reasons. And the final arguments are going to be in April in that case. So when it's two states fighting, it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, and there's a trial, which is crazy. You're supposed to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. But in water law, 2 states fighting, goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, and there's a trial, and they don't apply prior appropriation law. They apply equity. What's fair? And they look at all sorts of things, like what are the needs of each state? How careful are they being to conserve their water? Are they being wasteful? Are they not? They do look at who started using water first. What would the harm be if they had to give up that water? So they look at a variety of factors. And then that same notion comes into play with international treaties. They try to figure out an equitable division of the waters. So we've got headwaters treaties with, and boundary waters treaties with Canada, for example, that are affected by the Fort Belknap Compact, actually. Yeah.
What does the law say about waters that don't flow on the surface, but rather underneath the ground? Are they considered the same, or are they considered to be different types of water?
That's a great question. So you have to come to Bill Wisner's talk, because he's going to talk about the connection between surface and groundwater, and he's great at that. So that thinking has evolved, but it's another Lord of yesterday. If you go back to the old cases, the court said groundwater is a strange and mysterious force beyond the reach of law. And they basically said, if you dig and you find water under the ground of your property, that belongs to you. And there was no notion of really, it's connected to the surface. There's a relationship there, and you can deplete surface water if you pump groundwater. Jim Nave's here. He's the groundwater expert. So he could get up here and tell you all about this too. So today the law in some states still is that. Like you can go to T. Boone Pickens in Texas is right now trying to pump the state dry, and he's making a lot. He's always finding a good financial opportunity, but it's completely disconnected from surface. They don't look at them together. But Montana has, for a few decades now, tried to apply prior appropriation to groundwater as well, and more looking at how groundwater withdrawal affects surface water. And in a closed basin, if you want to develop groundwater, you have to replace depletions that you might cause to the surface. So Montana's, I think, in pretty good shape. Jim, am I? Yeah, you think they're in pretty good shape? Yeah, fairly. The trick with groundwater and prior appropriation is, what if someone drills the first person drills a shallow well, and if anybody else drills, they're like, I'm first in time, first in right, and your well lowered the water table and I'm not getting mine, and I'm senior, so you have to stop. And they can create a monopoly, right? So it works slightly different with groundwater. You have to say, maybe that shallow first senior user, maybe they have to pay to dig a deeper well also. So it works slightly different with groundwater, but.
Other questions?
Did you have one in the front?
Periodically, I guess it's I'm not sure who's in charge of the rivers, but the Mississippi River and transportation, they want to dewater Fort Peck. Where does that come in with all these laws? They call for more water out of Fort Peck, and there have been times when it's been way, way down, not because of drought, but they're able to do that.
I'm going to take a stab in the dark because I don't know exactly why they're doing it, but I'm guessing when they put these compacts together, they do all this horse trading. Like the Fort Belknap tribes was deemed to be entitled to the full flow of the Milk River. But did they get the full flow in the compact? No. So they say, oh, you get some of the milk, you get some storage out of here, and they figure out ways of putting water together to make up for the amount that they're not taking out. So sometimes reservoirs are called on, if the river gets low, to fulfill another water right of a senior user. So it could be because of a compact or other
So that's sort of
obligation.
sort of riparianism if we're downstream, and is that?
I don't. No, it's actually, to me, it's more like marketing. The idea that you can replace someone's water that they're entitled to with water from somewhere else. And so it's commodifying the water. Yeah.
Well, I don't have a very good question, but I always thought it'd be cool to be William Andrews Clark, because that guy was 5'4" on a good day, and he dams up a river for his own use. So what happens with water law if you want to just use the river but not divert it or use it directly, except to build or to make power?
To make power. So that would require a water right. So hydropower would be another beneficial use.
Running it through the turbines. Okay.
Yep. I almost used a story about William W.A. Clark, because there's another great water rights story with him taking water from this guy who got there first, and they talked him out of using it and said, just let us use it for a couple of years, and then you can have it back. And he went to the Klondike, and he came back, and W.A. Clark had sold all the water of the Wise River off to another company, a utility company. And he lost, because the court said, you use it or you lose it, right?
Thank you,
Yeah.
Michelle. You're a great instructor.
Thank you, Mara.
Do you have any opinion as to why all of the tribes of Montana have entered into compacts except our tribe, the Salish Kootenai?
All of the, and they have a proposed compact like the other tribes. It just politically isn't moving through the process as smoothly as the other compacts have. I think that's it, right? It's the political concerns associated with the provisions and the different constituents that are speaking to their elected representatives. Because, well, I should back up and say, a compact has to get ratified, right? It gets ratified by the tribal leadership, the state legislature, and ultimately Congress, because the federal government will be involved, and there's often federal funding to pay off certain damages. So a lot of political officials have to sign off on it, and if their constituents have concerns about the provisions, then they're not ready to sign off.
I don't really know what the ownership is on the other reservations, but does it have something to do with the fact that so many whites have land on the Flathead Reservation?
I know that the state of Montana saved the Flathead Reservation Compact for last because of the ownership pattern being so complicated. It's a reservation that was opened up to allotment. And so there are parcels of land. It's a checkerboard ownership of tribal land and non-Indian land. And so there is state law, non-Indian water rights, and tribal water rights, and tribal water rights held by non-Indians who bought land from Indian people. It's very complicated. And there's a federal project. We talked about subsidizing federal. There's a federal irrigation project that serves tribal and non-tribal members that has its own water right. So it's definitely more complicated than. And the unique provisions I mentioned of the Hellgate Treaty involving the right to fish in usual and accustomed places on and off the reservation. So it's not just the ownership in the reservation that's affected, it's water users and other reaches off reservation where they have customary fishing rights. And I think that might even have been one of the big sticking points, is the off-reservation stream flow claims. Yeah. And
Do-
so, oh, go ahead.
Do water rights go with the property and the usage? Can somebody that has property rights that wants to sell off some of their land, does that automatically take some of the water rights when you sell that land? Or does the person really own it and they can keep the water rights but sell the land or something like that?
All of the above. You can do either. So my water law students have to do these hypothetical transactions where they go through different scenarios. But one of them is you sell your land and you don't say anything in your deed, the water automatically goes. It's considered attached to the land, appurtenant. But you could also expressly say, I keep it, I reserve it, I remove it from the land, and I'd like to market it and sell it to someone else. They would have to go to Jim Nave and get permission to do that, but you can do either. Yes, sir?
If a landowner uses water, say in 1935, and then doesn't use the water for 50 years, does he still have that prior water right?
Use it or lose it.
Use it or lose it?
Yeah, so neighbors might argue it's been abandoned, and it's totally a fact question. Someone could come in and say, I was called off to fight in the war, and so I couldn't use my water, and then there was a drought, and then I leased it for, they could come up with things that they've been doing to explain the non-use, but 50 years is a really long time. It would be a tough one to rebut the presumption of abandonment. Yeah.
This one might sound kind of dumb, but I'll ask it anyway.
It won't.
Other than the requirement that you use it to maintain your water right, is there any solitary disadvantage to having one? That someone wanting to get it away from someone could leverage, for example?
Are you asking, like, what are the costs of having a water right?
Right. Or are there any responsibilities that are tied to it that you have to, or obligations that you must fulfill other than just using it?
Besides using it, maintaining your diversion and good repair, right? So your ditch can leak and leak like Messrs. Barney and Sage, but if you get a crack in your ditch and it's just gushing out in the wrong place, that's waste and you can get in trouble for that. You can lose part of your water. So you're supposed to keep things in reasonably good repair. What are some of the other? Well, I didn't even talk about adjudication, but if you have an old water right, a lot of people, just have water rights that they developed by putting them to use. There's no even record. So the water court in Montana is looking at all water rights ever claimed before 1973. And if you have one of those, you do have to pay to be in water court and defend your water right and get it recognized. So there's a legal cost associated with an old water right.
There's a move afoot to move water from the Columbia River Basin to the south. Is the state of Montana thinking about that, and any legislation or regulations they're thinking of preventing it or allowing it?
I am not an expert on the Columbia River Basin Treaty, which is up for renegotiation right now. But Montana and tribes and other states are participants. So who is an expert on the Columbia River Basin Treaty? Anybody? I don't know about the move afoot to move water to the south. So when I don't know the answer, I always tell my students I'll answer it next time. So I'll answer it next class. No. I'll have to look and see. I can email you. I don't know about the move afoot.
Do you think we should keep using it or losing it?
As I mentioned, the law is starting to show an openness to the idea of leaving water alone and that being a use. And so the in-stream flow statute that I mentioned actually says to that senior irrigator, if you do lease this water for the fishery, you are not deemed to have abandoned it. And so it's a protection. And so if we can build that in other scenarios where non-use, maybe like CRP, right? You leave your field fallow, it's okay, you know, it's not a mark against you. So maybe there are other scenarios where we could say, because of the following reasons, leaving the water in the stream is really important right now. Maybe it's certain seasons or certain drought years. And maybe that should be a defense against abandonment. So, yeah.
Any other questions? One last question.
This question relates to pollution. And if whether it be seeds, GMO seeds, or just noxious weeds, does the person that owns the riparian rights have a duty to the downstream users to keep that stream bank clean?
Whoa. You guys are testing the outer limits of my... So, couple possibilities. Does anybody, first of all, does anybody actually know the answer before I, huh? Before I sit here and try to guess. I'll defer to any experts. So if you're in a water conservation district, there might be some rules for the users in that district. It'd be district specific, what the bylaws are for that district, if there's anything about maintenance of the shoreline along the water. The Clean Water Act is a federal law that regulates some discharges, but I don't think it includes, it's just pollutants. I don't know that they would consider seeds to be a pollutant. Pesticides and herbicides and things like that. But no, I don't think seeds. Gosh. Wow. Next class.
Another big round of applause.
Next week, as Michelle said, Bill Woosner will be here, and he will be taking up with groundwater, and I think it'll be a fascinating talk.